The man who bought me wasn't a monster, at least not at first. He paid my mother 2 silver coins, a jug of whiskey, and a promise of half a steer. I watched the coins disappear into her calloused palm, her knuckles white. She didn't look at me. Not once. She just unlatched the iron cuffs from my wrists, the metal cold and biting against my skin. The raw, red marks they left behind were a map of the last few hours of my life. "Don't give him trouble," she'd muttered, her breath smelling of cheap gin and rot. "He paid more than you're worth." Then she shoved me toward him, toward the stranger. His name was Elias. He was tall, built like an old oak tree that had weathered too many storms. His eyes were the color of a winter sky right before the snow falls, empty and vast. He didn't look at my swollen belly, now 8 months along. He didn't look at the tear tracks on my cheeks. He looked right through me, as if I were a ghost already. He didn't touch me. He just nodded toward the horse waiting in the twilight shadows, its breath pluming in the cold air. The ride to his homestead was 3 miles of suffocating silence. The only sounds were the horse's hooves on the dusty trail and the whisper of the wind through the pines. It felt like the trees were talking about me, judging me. His house sat on the edge of the world, a small, dark shape against a sky that was bleeding purple and orange. No fences, no neighbors, just miles of wild, unforgiving land. It wasn't a home. It was a final stop. He helped me down from the horse, his hand hovering near my arm, but never making contact. He pointed to the door. "Go on, I'm Funachana," he said. His voice was gravel, like stones rolling downhill. Inside, the air was clean. Too clean. It smelled of lemon oil and wood smoke, a sterile scent that scrubbed the life out of the room. There was no clutter, no sign of living. Just a single photograph hanging crooked over the stone fireplace. I stepped closer. It was a woman with dark, kind eyes. In her arms, she held a baby blanket, intricately stitched with little yellow birds. But the blanket was empty. Her arms were wrapped around nothing. My blood ran cold. "That room," Elias said, pointing to a door on the left. "The bed is made. There's water on the stove. I won't come in." I didn't answer. My hand drifted down, my fingers hovering near the secret fold in the hem of my worn leather boot. I'd spent 2 nights sewing it in, my fingers raw, but the feel of the thin, sharp blade hidden inside was the only comfort I had left in the world. I nodded once, my throat too tight to speak, and stepped into the room he'd given me. It was a cage, no matter how clean it was. The door shut behind me with a soft click, and I was alone. But I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I wasn't safe. Not yet. The room he gave me was a shrine. It smelled of lavender and dust and a sorrow so old it had seeped into the wood. The quilt on the bed was a masterpiece of tiny, perfect stitches, a pattern of blooming roses in shades of pale pink and deep crimson. It was too beautiful for a house like this, too delicate. On the dresser, a silver-backed brush and mirror sat waiting, as if their owner had just stepped out and would be back any minute. Beside them, a pair of small, unused leather shoes. This wasn't just a guest room. It was her room. The room of the woman in the photograph. The woman with the empty blanket. I didn't sleep. How could I? I lay on my back, one hand resting on my belly, feeling the restless flutter of the life inside me. The other hand was wrapped tight around the smooth wooden hilt of my knife, which I'd pulled from my boot. The steel was cold against my palm. Every creak of the old house, every sigh of the wind outside the window, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my veins. I was a cornered animal, ready to fight, ready to draw blood if I had to. Around midnight, the silence became too much to bear. I slid out from under the heavy quilt, my bare feet silent on the cold wooden floorboards. The knife felt heavier now, more real. I held it in front of me as I crept toward the door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I eased the door open a crack. The main room was dark, the embers in the fireplace glowing a dull, menacing red. No sound, no movement. Where was he? I slipped out, moving like a shadow along the wall, my eyes scanning the darkness. The front door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of misty moonlight cutting across the floor. A storm was rolling in. I could smell the rain on the wind. I moved to the door and looked out onto the porch. And I saw him. He wasn't in his room. He wasn't waiting for me. He was kneeling on the wet porch boards, the rain beginning to fall, soaking his hair in his thin cotton shirt. A single oil lamp sputtered beside him, casting long, dancing shadows. His back was to me, his shoulders slumped. He was working on something, his hands moving with a slow, deliberate grace. He was stitching a piece of new leather onto a child's saddle, a tiny saddle, no bigger than my two hands put together. As he worked, he spoke. His voice was a low murmur, almost lost in the sound of the falling rain. "She always said this place needed mending," he whispered to the night. "She meant more than the fence." I stood frozen in the doorway, the knife hanging useless at my side. The rain picked up, turning from a whisper to a hiss. He didn't seem to notice. He just kept stitching, his head bowed, his entire being focused on this one, small, impossible task. He finally looked up, his eyes finding me in the darkness of the doorway. There was no surprise on his face, no anger, just a profound, bottomless weariness. "Couldn't sleep," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. I shook my head, unable to find my voice. He nodded once, a slow, tired gesture, and then he turned back to the tiny saddle, his needle dipping in and out of the wet leather, stitching a phantom hope back together in the middle of the storm. I backed away, slipping back into the lavender-scented room. I slid the knife under my pillow. I didn't trust him, not yet, but the fear was changing into something else, something more confusing, something that felt an awful lot like pity, and that scared me more than anything. The next morning I woke to the smell of coffee and baking bread. Outside my door on the floor was a plate with two thick slices of warm cornbread and a small jar of blackberry jam. There was no note, no explanation, just a silent offering. I ate slowly, perched on the edge of the bed, the knife still under my pillow. The food was a kindness, but kindness from a stranger who bought you is just a different kind of chain. It makes you wonder what he'll expect in return. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm. Elias would be gone before sunrise, tending to his ranch, and return long after sunset. He never spoke to me unless necessary. He'd leave food on the table, firewood stacked by the hearth, and once, a bar of soap that smelled of roses. He moved around the edges of my life, a silent, watchful presence. I spent my time in the dead woman's room, running my fingers over the unfinished embroidery she'd left in a hoop on the windowsill. A single, perfect rose, half finished. Her Bible sat on the nightstand, its pages worn thin, the Psalms underlined with a faint pencil. I was living in the ghost of her life, and I couldn't decide if it was a comfort or a threat. The silence of the house was different from any silence I had ever known. It wasn't the angry, tense silence of my mother's shack, waiting for the next explosion of rage. It was a heavy, mournful silence, thick with unspoken grief. It let me breathe, but it also felt like it was slowly suffocating me. Then one afternoon, the silence was shattered. A sharp, aggressive knock rattled the front door. Before I could even react, Elias was there, opening it. A woman stood on the porch, her face pinched and sour, her eyes as sharp and black as a crow's. Mud caked her boots, and she held a basket clutched in one bony hand. "Martha," Elias said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Came for the eggs," the woman snapped, her gaze sliding right past him and landing on me. Her eyes raked over my body, lingering on the swell of my belly. A cruel smirk twisted her lips. "Well now," she hissed, planting her hands on her hips. "Ain't she ripe? Barely a child herself, and already swelled up like a prize pumpkin. What's the matter, Elias? The town getting too quiet without a scandal to your name?" I instinctively took a step back, pulling my shawl tighter around me. Elias didn't move a muscle. He just stood there, a stone wall against her venom. "Is she your new pet?" Martha spat, taking a step closer. "Didn't take you long, did it? Still digging the dirt off your hands from burying your wife? And you bring this barefoot hussy in from the flats. But you always did like them young and helpless, didn't you?" The air went thin. The accusation hung between them, ugly and sharp. My hand trembled. What did she mean? Burying your wife? I looked at Elias, waiting for him to deny it, to defend me, to defend himself. He did nothing. "You want eggs, Martha?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Take them and go." He turned, walked to the small pantry, and came back with a half-dozen eggs. He held them out to her. She snatched them from his hand, her eyes still burning holes in me. "She won't last," she sneered. "Trash like this never does. You'll bury her right next to the other one." Still, Elias said nothing. He simply stepped back and closed the door in her face. Not a slam. A soft, final click that echoed in the ringing silence. He didn't look at me. He didn't explain. He walked back out to the porch, sat in his worn rocking chair, and began to whittle a piece of wood as if nothing had happened. He hadn't defended me. He hadn't denied it. And in that moment, a horrifying thought took root in my mind. The woman in the picture, the empty blanket, the rumors. He didn't buy me to save me. He bought me as a replacement. And when he was done with me, he'd put me in the ground, just like the first one. The knife under my pillow suddenly felt very, very small. That night, the wind howled around the lonely house like a hungry wolf. It rattled the windows and seeped through the floorboards, a chilling reminder of how isolated I was, how trapped. Martha's words echoed in my head. "You'll bury her right next to the other one." He hadn't denied it. The silence that had once been a strange sort of peace now felt like a countdown. Every tick of the clock on the mantel was a second closer to what? I didn't know, and that was the most terrifying part. I had to get out. Now. I waited until I was sure he was asleep. I dressed in the dark, pulling on the thickest socks I had and the worn coat he'd left on a peg for me. The knife was back in its secret sheath in my boot. Its presence was a cold, hard promise against my ankle. I wouldn't be taken without a fight. I slipped out the back door into the biting cold. A sudden, fierce snowstorm had blown in, the flakes thick and fast, already blanketing the ground in a ghostly white. Good, it would cover my tracks. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew it was away. Away from the silent man and the ghost of his dead wife. Away from a house that felt more like a tomb than a home. I pushed on through the swirling snow, my teeth chattering, my breath coming in ragged puffs. The wind was a physical force, shoving me back, trying to turn me around. But I wouldn't let it. I was halfway across the open field between the house and the dark line of pine trees when it happened. A sudden, searing pain ripped through my lower back. It was so sharp, so violent, it stole my breath and buckled my knees. I gasped, falling to the ground, the snow soaking through my thin dress instantly. "No!" I whispered, my hand flying to my belly. "No! Not now! Please!" Another wave of pain crashed over me, stronger this time, tightening my entire body into a knot. The baby. It was too soon. It was far too soon. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the wind. I was going to die out here. Me and my baby, we were going to freeze to death in a field in the middle of nowhere. Then, through the howling of the storm, I heard another sound. Footsteps, heavy and fast, crunching through the snow, coming right for me. A dark shape emerged from the swirling white. Elias. His face was a mask of urgency, his eyes wide in the faint moonlight. "Clara!" he shouted over the wind. I couldn't answer. The pain was all-consuming. He was beside me in an instant, his hands finding me in the dark. Without a word, he scooped me up into his arms. I was pressed against the rough, wet wool of his coat, my head lolling against his shoulder. He was surprisingly strong, and he held me as if I weighed nothing at all. He carried me back toward the house, his steps sure and steady against the storm. He didn't stumble. He didn't slow. He just moved through the blizzard with a grim determination. He burst through the door and carried me straight to my room, laying me gently on the bed with the rose-stitched quilt. He knelt beside me, his face flushed from the cold, his expression something I had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pity. It was fear. He placed a calloused hand on my stomach, his touch unexpectedly gentle. The baby kicked against his palm, his eyes locked with mine. His voice, when he spoke, was raw, cracking with an emotion I couldn't name. "Don't let them win," he rasped, his gaze burning into me. "Don't let your child die out here because of what people say. His words hit me harder than the wind, harder than the pain. Don't let them win. He wasn't talking about the storm. He was talking about Martha, about the town, about the whispers that had driven me out into the snow. He understood. And then he said something that shattered everything I thought I knew about him. I already buried one family in this house, he said, his voice thick with a grief so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. I will not bury another. He wasn't a monster. He was a man haunted by ghosts, and I had just run headfirst into his graveyard. The storm passed. The pain subsided into a dull, persistent ache. The immediate danger was over, but the air in the small room was thick with the ghosts of his words. I already buried one family. He built up the fire until the hearth glowed, chasing the chill from the room. He brought me a cup of warm broth and sat not in a chair, but on the floor by the bed, his back against the wall, watching the flames. He didn't leave me alone. For the first time, I spoke about my past. The words came out in a broken whisper, telling a story I had never told anyone. My mother, she wanted me to serve drinks at the saloon, I said, my eyes fixed on the dancing fire. The miners paid more if the girls were pretty, if they let them touch. I swallowed hard. I said no, just once. She locked me in the goat shed for 2 days with no food. After that, I learned to stop saying no. Elias's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek, but he remained silent. I ran away, I continued. Got a job cleaning at a boarding house. That's where I met him, the baby's father. He was a traveler, passing through. He was kind. He brought me flowers. He told me I was beautiful. I paused, the memory turning sour in my mouth. He was kind until he wasn't. One morning, he was just gone. I don't even know if he knew about the baby. I finally looked at Elias. His face was etched in shadow, his expression unreadable. He just stared into the fire, his shoulders tense, carrying the weight of my story alongside his own. He nodded once, a slow, heavy gesture. Then he rose, placed another log on the fire with careful precision, and turned to leave. I thought that was it. The exchange was over, but he stopped at the door. My wife's name was Ilara, he said, his back still to me. She loved roses, said even the hardest ground could be coaxed into blooming if you were patient enough. He was quiet for a long moment. She was the patient one, not me. And then he was gone, leaving me alone with the fire and the ghost of a woman named Ilara who loved roses. Sleep wouldn't come. I drifted in a haze of pain and exhaustion, my mind replaying the night's events. Sometime deep in the night, long after the moon had set, I woke with a start. There was a sound, a soft, rhythmic sound coming from the main room. Thump, scrape, thump, scrape. My fear, which had been quieted, flared back to life. Was he building something? A crib? Or something else? A box? My hand went to the knife under my pillow. I slipped out of bed again, my body aching with every movement. I crept to the door and peered through the crack. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint, pulsing glow across the room. Illis was sitting at the small wooden table, his back to me. The lamplight cast his shadow, large and distorted, across the wall. He was carving something, a small block of pine wood. I watched, holding my breath, as the shape slowly emerged from the wood. It was a bird, a tiny, perfect little bird, with delicate wings and a smooth, rounded body. He worked with an intense, heartbreaking concentration, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. As he carved, he began to cry. It wasn't a loud, dramatic sound. It was a silent, gut-wrenching grief. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks, dripping onto the wood shavings in his lap. His shoulders shook with the force of his sorrow. He held the half-finished bird up to the lamplight, his thumb stroking its wooden wing. I was making this for the first one, he whispered to the empty room, his voice choked and broken. A boy. We were going to call him Samuel. He set the bird down and picked up another small carved object from the table, a tiny wooden horse. This was for the second. A girl, he went on, his voice a litany of loss. One by one, he touched a collection of small, unfinished wooden toys. A boat, a star, a bear. each one a monument to a life that never was. 7, he finally whispered, his head bowed. We lost 7. Some were born sleeping. Some only lived a few hours. I buried each one myself, up on the ridge. He finally looked up, his gaze unfocused, staring at the photograph of his wife above the mantel. After the 7th, she just faded. The doctor said her heart gave out, but I know the truth. She died of a broken heart, and I let her. The silence that followed was absolute. He wasn't a monster who had killed his wife. He was a man who had watched his entire world die, piece by piece, and had been left alone to stand guard over the graves. And I was now living in the house where all that hope had turned to dust. The air was so thick with sorrow, I felt like I was drowning in it. The next morning the world was clean and white, covered in a thick blanket of fresh snow. The sky was a brilliant cloudless blue. It felt like a lie. Elias was gone when I woke up. He'd left for town, his note on the table said, to get supplies. Don't go out, it read. Rest. I didn't listen. As soon as his horse was out of sight, I wrapped myself in the heavy wool coat and stepped outside. The cold air was sharp and clean. I knew where I had to go, up on the ridge. I followed the faint trail behind the barn, my boots sinking deep into the fresh snow. The walk was harder than I expected, my body still weak, my belly heavy and tight. I pushed on, my breath pluming in front of me, until I reached a small grove of pine trees at the top of a gentle rise. And there they were, 7 small wooden markers sticking up from the snow. They were weathered and gray, arranged in a neat, heartbreaking line. No names, just numbers, crudely carved into the wood. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Beside the 7th marker was a larger one, for Alara. I fell to my knees in the snow, the cold seeping through my dress, but I didn't feel it. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the 7th marker. A life that had lasted only a few hours was remembered only by a number. The tears I had been holding back for weeks finally came. I cried for the 7 babies who never got a name. I cried for the woman who died of a broken heart. I cried for the silent, grieving man who was left behind. And I cried for myself and for the child growing inside me, a tiny flicker of life in this vast, lonely land of death. I don't know how long I knelt there, lost in a storm of grief. I didn't hear him approach. I thought you killed her. I gasped and spun around. Elias was standing at the edge of the trees, his hat in his hands. He must have come back early. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on me. That's what they say in town, I whispered, my voice thick with tears. Martha, she said you buried her. I know what they say, he replied, his voice quiet, and I let them. Why? The word was a cry. Why would you let them think you're a monster? Because arguing takes more breath than silence, he said, his gaze drifting over the 7 small graves. And after a while, silence was all I had left. Each one took a little more of her and a little more of me. By the 7th, there was nothing left to say. He took a step closer, his boots crunching in the snow. She tried to plant roses here, he said, nodding toward the plot of land around the graves. Every spring. She said this place needed some life, but the soil's too thin, the wind's too harsh. They never grew. I stood up slowly, wiping the tears from my face with the back of my hand. I looked from the graves to his face, and for the first time I saw him. Not the monster, not the silent stranger, but the man underneath, a man hollowed out by loss. Maybe this spring, I said, my voice barely a whisper, we could try again. A flicker of something, surprise, disbelief, passed through his eyes. It was there and gone in an instant, replaced by his usual stoic mask. But I saw it. He looked at me, at my swollen belly, then back at the graves. He gave a single slow nod, the kind of nod a man gives when he hears a language he thought he'd forgotten how to speak. We stood there for a long time, not speaking, the silence between us no longer an enemy. It was a shared space, a quiet understanding. Then together we walked back down the ridge, our footsteps falling side by side in the snow. We were 2 broken people, standing in a graveyard, talking about planting flowers. And for the first time since my mother sold me, it felt a little like hope. The thaw came slowly, then all at once. The snow retreated, leaving the earth damp and smelling of new life. Stubborn green shoots pushed their way through the mud. The sky, which had been a constant, oppressive gray, began to show patches of brilliant blue. Something inside the house began to thaw too. The silence was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer a wall between us. It was a quiet space where we could simply be. I no longer hid in the dead woman's room. I started helping him, my movements slow and clumsy with the weight of the baby. I'd hold the nails while he mended the fence. I'd stir the stew while he cleaned his tools. We worked together, two solitary planets that had slowly, cautiously, fallen into a shared orbit. In the evenings, I started reading aloud from Alara's Bible. The pages were soft as cloth, and her faint pencil marks guided my words. Elias would sit in his rocking chair by the fire, whittling one of his little wooden animals, and listen. "Sorrow may endure for a night," I read one evening, "but joy cometh in the morning." I paused. "What do you think that means?" Elias didn't look up from his work. The knife in his hand moved steadily, shaving thin curls from the block of pine. "It means," he said, his voice low, "that sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what's worth keeping." One afternoon, I found him out by the fence line near the graves. He had a row of wooden stakes hammered into the ground, and beside each one, he was carefully placing a small, dark bulb into the freshly turned earth. "You're planting the roses," I said softly. He glanced up, wiping a smear of dirt from his forehead. "They won't take," he said, his voice flat with resignation. "Never have." I knelt beside him, my joints protesting, and pressed my hand into the cool, damp soil. "Then why do you keep trying?" He stopped his work and looked out at the ridge, at the 7 small markers. "Because she believed they would," he said quietly. "She used to say that even the hardest ground gives in if you're patient enough." He finally turned his gaze to me, and his eyes were clear and direct. I never believed it, but I kept planting, because when she'd look out the window and see the stakes in the ground, even though nothing ever bloomed, she would smile, and for a minute it was enough. I swallowed the lump that had formed in my throat. I reached for one of the bulbs and gently covered it with soil, my fingers working alongside his. We worked in silence for a while, planting a garden of impossible hope on the edge of a graveyard. Later that night, the baby was kicking, a strong, rhythmic thumping against my ribs. I placed my hand on my stomach, a smile touching my lips. "If it's a girl," I said into the quiet room, "I'll name her Rose." Elias looked up from the small wooden bird he was finally finishing, sanding its wings smooth. His eyes met mine across the warm, firelit space. "She'll be stubborn," I added, a tear tracing a path down my cheek. "She'll grow where no one thinks she can, even if it takes time." He set the finished bird down on the mantel, next to the photograph of his smiling wife. He nodded, not quickly, but with a slow, considered weight. "That's a good name," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he didn't try to hide. "And a better hope." That night, for the first time, I didn't dream of my mother, or the saloon, or the man who had left me. I dreamed of sunlight filtering through pink rose petals. I dreamed of a little girl with Elias's quiet eyes, her laughter chasing butterflies through a field of impossible flowers. And in the dream, for the first time, the roses bloomed. The sky turned angry. One hot, dry evening, the air went completely still. The usual chorus of coyotes and crickets fell silent. The clouds on the horizon turned a bruised, ugly purple, and a low rumble of thunder echoed from the distant mountains. Elias stood on the porch, his face tight, sniffing the air. "Something's wrong," he muttered. Then we saw it, a faint orange flicker on the peak of Briar Ridge, miles away. Then another, and then came the smell, a sharp, acrid smell of smoke. "Fire," he said, his voice grim. He burst back into the house, his movements suddenly sharp and urgent. "It's moving fast. The wind's bringing it this way." My heart leaped into my throat. I moved to the doorway and saw it clearly now. A terrifying line of orange was eating its way down the mountainside, devouring the dry forest. "We have to go," Elias said, grabbing blankets and soaking them in the water bucket. There's an old stone hut built into the hillside on the North Trail. It's the only place that will be safe. I nodded, my hands shaking as I reached for my coat. But as I turned, a pain, sharp and blinding, shot through my entire body. It was a white-hot poker driving down my spine. I cried out, doubling over, my hands clutching the edge of the table to keep from falling. "Elias!" I gasped, the word torn from my throat. He was at my side in an instant, his eyes wide with a new kind of terror. "It's time," I whispered, panic clawing at me. "The baby, it's coming." Another contraction seized me, harder this time, stealing my breath, making the world go black at the edges. The smoke was thicker now, pouring through the open door, making my eyes water and my throat burn. The distant roar of the fire was getting louder. We were trapped. The baby was coming, and the world was burning down around us. Elias didn't hesitate. He wrapped one of the soaked blankets around my shoulders, the wet wool a shocking cold against my skin. He wrapped the other around himself. Then, with a strength I didn't know he possessed, he lifted me into his arms, cradling me against his chest. "Hold on," he grunted, his face a mask of grim determination. He kicked the door open and ran. Outside, the world had become a living hell. The sky was a sickening orange-black. Ash rained down like hot snow, and the wind screamed, carrying embers that glowed like angry red eyes in the smoke. The fire was no longer on a distant ridge. It was here. The trees at the edge of the property were already igniting, exploding into torches that lit our path. Elias ran, his breath coming in ragged bursts, his boots pounding on the hard, dry earth. He knew the way to the hut by heart, a twisting path through a ravine choked with dry brush. Every step sent a jolt of agony through me as the contractions came faster, stronger, one on top of another. "I can't," I sobbed into his chest, the smoke and pain overwhelming me. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can," he gritted out between breaths. "Breathe, Clara. Just breathe. Hold on to me." The heat was unbearable. I could feel it searing my skin through the wet blanket. Trees crashed down around us, their branches bursting into flame. The roar was deafening. I closed my eyes, certain we were about to be consumed. Then, just as I felt myself losing consciousness, we were there. The stone hut, built into the side of the hill, its heavy oak door a promise of safety. Elias kicked it open and stumbled inside, the door slamming shut behind us, cutting off the roar and the heat. He laid me down on the cool dirt floor. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of earth and stone. It was a tomb. It was a sanctuary. He worked quickly, using the few dry blankets stored inside to make a pallet for me, lighting a small oil lamp that cast flickering shadows on the stone walls. Outside, the fire raged. We could hear it, a muffled, terrifying thunder, as if a great beast were trying to claw its way in. Then the real pain began. Clara screamed, her body arching off the floor. She clutched his hand, her nails digging into his skin, but he didn't flinch. "I'm scared," she cried, her voice raw. He knelt beside her, his face streaked with soot, his eyes reflecting the lamplight. "So am I," he said, his voice steady and calm. "But you are not alone." He stayed with me through all of it. Hours bled together in a haze of sweat and pain and fear. He wiped my brow. He gave me water. He whispered words of encouragement. He had seen death in childbirth 7 times. This time, he was a warrior, fighting it back with every ounce of his being. And then, after a final, desperate push that felt like it was tearing me in two, there was a sudden, shocking silence. The pain was gone, and over the distant dying roar of the fire, another sound filled the small stone hut. A cry, a high-pitched, furious, beautiful cry. The sound of a new life demanding to be heard. The baby's wail filled the darkness, echoing off the stone walls. Tears streamed down my face as Elias, his hands shaking, wrapped the tiny, slippery body in a piece of clean cloth and placed her in my arms. "A girl," he whispered, his voice cracking. I laughed and cried at the same time, pulling her close to my chest. She was so small, so perfect. "Rose," I sobbed. "Her name is Rose." Outside, the fire had finally passed. Inside, a new life had just begun. but the smoke had followed us in, a thin, insidious haze. As I looked at Elias, his face pale in the lamplight, his eyes suddenly rolled back in his head. He collapsed onto the floor without a sound. Elias! The name was a raw scream torn from my throat. I shifted the crying baby into the crook of one arm and crawled toward him, my own body screaming in protest. No, 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 I chanted, my hands shaking as I reached for him. Elias, wake up! Look at me! He didn't move. His face was a ghastly gray color under the streaks of soot. His lips were blue. I pressed my ear to his chest, praying, begging. Silence. No. There. A heartbeat, faint, thready. But it was there. The smoke. He had breathed in too much smoke while carrying me, while running through the flames. He had saved us, and it had killed him. Please, I whispered, my forehead pressed against his still shoulder. Please don't leave. Not now. Not when she's finally here. I shook him, my desperation growing. You don't get to do this. You don't get to save us and then leave us alone. He remained limp, a dead weight on the cold stone floor. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over me. I was alone again, with a newborn baby, in the middle of a burned-out wilderness. And then, Rose cried, it wasn't a whimper of hunger. It was a full-throated, piercing wail of pure, undiluted life. It was a sound of rage and insistence, a tiny, furious command to the world. I am here. The sound ripped through the suffocating silence of the hut, and Elias gasped, a huge, shuddering, rasping gasp for air. His chest rose and fell. His eyelids fluttered. He coughed, a deep, rattling sound that shook his whole body. Then his eyes opened, unfocused at first, then slowly finding my face. She's got lungs, he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. A laugh that was half a sob escaped my lips. So do you, I whispered, tears of relief pouring down my face. He managed a faint smile, his eyes fluttering closed again. Guess I'll need them, he murmured. And then his breathing, though shallow, evened out. He was alive. The cry of the child he had helped bring into the world had, in turn, called him back. We stayed in that stone hut for 2 days, waiting for the smoke to clear and for Elias to regain his strength. We were 3 survivors, huddled together in the dark, surrounded by the ruins of the world we knew. We were bound not by blood, but by fire and birth and a single miraculous cry in the dark, a rose blooming in the ash. 1 year later, the silence was gone. The house, which we rebuilt board by board, was filled with the sound of life. Laughter echoed in the kitchen. A baby's happy babbling drifted from the front room. The porch, once a place of lonely vigil, was now a gathering spot. The rose bushes we planted by the graves had bloomed. Not perfectly, not all at once, but they had bloomed. Stubborn, beautiful pink blossoms that defied the thin soil and the harsh wind. Hope made real. The town had changed too. Or maybe we had. After the fire, which had threatened to wipe out half the homesteads in the valley, people started seeing things differently. They saw the soot-stained man who had carried a laboring girl through a wall of flame. They saw the baby who had been born in the middle of it. Martha was the first to come, a week after the fire. She stood on our scorched porch, holding a freshly baked apple pie, and she couldn't meet my eyes. The fire, she'd stammered. It was my boy, playing with matches. He didn't mean for it to... She trailed off, her face crumbling. I'm sorry, she whispered. We didn't press charges. What was the point? The fire had taken so much, but it had given us something too. It had burned away the old stories, the old poisons, and left the ground clear for something new to grow. Now baskets of cornbread and jars of jam appeared on our doorstep. Apologies came, quiet and sincere. Quilts were left and hand-knitted socks for the baby. The whispers had stopped. This evening the sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. Rose, who now had a head full of wild, dark curls, was toddling through the yard, her chubby hand clutching a wooden bird that Elias had carved for her. I watched her from the porch, my hand resting on my belly, round once more with a new life, a new hope. Elias came and stood behind me, wrapping his arms around me, his hand joining mine on the gentle swell. She called you Dada today, I said, leaning back against his chest. He chuckled, a low, warm sound that was now my favorite in all the world. She's a clever one. She's ours, I said softly, and the word was full of a meaning so deep it made my heart ache in the best possible way. He rested his chin on my shoulder, and together we watched our daughter. She stumbled, fell, and picked herself right back up, a determined look on her little face. She was a survivor. We all were. The land around us, once scorched and barren, was green again. Life had returned, stronger and more vibrant than before, and as Rose held up her wooden bird to the golden sky, its wings spread as if in flight, I knew that some things have to be burned to the ground to make way for miracles. Even in a world turned to ash, the roses can still bloom. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest night, joy can come in the morning, and that a family is something you build, not just something you're born into, then show your support with a like and a comment below. We want to hear your thoughts. And if you believe in second chances, in love that grows in the hardest ground, and in the quiet strength it takes to rebuild a life from the ashes, then make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss a single story of hope, hardship, and the enduring power of the human heart. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.